Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, the 2020 Election and Anti-Corruption and Compliance Perspective. My name is Jessica Tiltman, and I'm an assistant dean here at GW Law School, where I teach a course in anti-corruption and compliance. I am also the faculty advisor to the GW Law Anti-Corruption and Compliance Association, or ACCA, the organization here at GW Law, which is run by students who are interested in anti-corruption law and compliance. First, a huge thank you to ACCA's president, Camille Ali, who helped to organize today's program. Second, to the GW Law students listening today, if you're interested in learning more about this practice area, please consider joining the group so that you have access to programming, internships, jobs, and other opportunities that are regularly shared with association members. Now to the program. In 11 days, Americans will finish voting for the next president of the United States. The outcome of this election is uncertain, but one thing is clear. The future anti-corruption and compliance landscape is likely to vary dramatically depending on who wins. Today, we have an incredible panel of speakers who will share their predictions about what that landscape may look like and also offer some recommendations about where they would like to see changes in relevant laws and policies. Noah Bookbinder is the executive director of the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, also known as CREW. My colleague, Randall Eliason, is a professorial lecturer in law at GW Law School, where he teaches the white collar crime course. And Alexandra Raghi is the president and founder of Trace International. As I said before, in the chat function, you can find links to their bios as well. Now, before we can make predictions about what may happen in the future, we need to take a look backwards at what's already happened over the past 4 years with respect to anti-corruption enforcement and compliance. So to get the ball rolling, I'm going to turn to Noah first. Noah, first, thanks for coming and joining us today. If you could go ahead and provide an assessment of the current state of ethics law in the United States, that would be fantastic. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having me, and it's great to join such an impressive panel. So, I mean, I think in a word or a phrase, ethics law is in shambles right now. I think if you had asked me, say 5 years ago, I would have certainly said that our campaign finance law was deteriorating in the mass. As I think Randall is going to speak about later, I think it's been clear for some time that there are huge problems and gaps in our anti-corruption law. But I would have probably, if you'd asked me then, said that our ethics law was pretty good. Things seem to be kind of going okay on that front, and I would have been entirely wrong, because I think what we have learned over the past few years is that a lot of the success of our ethics laws and ethics rules really hinges on this word that's been overused in recent years, which is norms, on basically things that people have always done and kind of the commitment of people of goodwill to try to do the right thing. And in fact, when you have people who have absolutely no interest in maintaining an ethical government, it turns out that the laws and the rules that we have have tremendous holes in them and very little teeth when it comes to enforcement. We could talk about this all day, but I'll set up a few specific areas of that, and then we can get more into it later if people are interested. The first area I'd point to is conflicts of interest and self-enrichment. We have seen that in our laws that there is no prohibition in law or rules to a president or a vice president maintaining businesses while in office. It's something that never happened because people wanted to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. But this president has maintained a massive global business empire while in office. We at CREW have been tracking the resulting conflicts of interest. We actually just released a piece today saying that the total known conflicts of interest for Donald Trump as president from his businesses is now up above 3,500, including more than 150 instances of foreign government officials coming to his properties and his businesses. It's become clear that those wanting to influence the president understand that they can bring business to him, whether that's by coming for a meal or a hotel stay, by hosting a fundraiser at one of his resorts, by facilitating his businesses through trademarks or through building access to resorts, and just endless ways for people, for interest groups, for foreign governments, for individuals to curry favor with a sitting president. There are also almost endless ways for the president to use the presidency to bring money, put money into his own pocket. And that's something that it turns out is allowed under the law. There are emoluments clauses, these clauses in the Constitution that restrict executive branch employees from getting money from foreign governments, and the president from getting money also from the US government and the states. But it turns out that there is not a built-in enforcement mechanism. We've been litigating that, we've been doing pretty well with it, but it's a slow and arduous process. And then the tone is set from the top. So you see not just conflicts of interest with the president, but with his daughter and son-in-law, who are top advisors, and others throughout the administration. Another area is the use of government to promote specifically the president, but any official seeking re-election. There's a long-time law called the Hatch Act, which says that government officials can't use their official position for politics, essentially. And it's something, there have always been sort of low-level violations and small numbers of high-level violations. But now you have a really systematic attempt by this administration to use all of the powers of government to keep a president in power. Crew has filed multiple complaints. We've gotten now, I believe, 12 rulings of Hatch Act violations by this Office of Special Counsel that has jurisdiction there, including, in the case of President's advisor Kellyanne Conway, a recommendation that she be fired for repeated knowing violations. But ultimately, it was at the president's discretion whether or not to fire her, and he did not. These kinds of issues sort of start out seeming small bore. You have people tweeting, people giving TV interviews, but it has become a much bigger issue where, which you started to see when you had things like the Republican National Convention being broadcast from the White House, with government functions like naturalization ceremonies being a part of a partisan convention. You see government functions like the Postal Service being hijacked potentially for partisan gains. Again, it turns out that enforcement mechanisms are limited. The Hatch Act is a law, but the ability of the office that administers it to apply it, particularly to people in the White House and to cabinet officials, turns out to be very limited. A final area that I'll point to is the interference of the president and senior executive branch officials in law enforcement and accountability. We have seen systematic firing of inspectors general, firing and sidelining of inspectors general whose job it is to monitor things like ethics and accountability throughout the federal government. We've seen the political use of the Department of Justice through things like interference in prosecutions of friends and associates of the president, Roger Stone and Michael Flynn, most prominently, the kind of ginning up of investigations that might be harmful to the president's opponents. And again, while there were memos in place, there were traditions in place, turns out that the law did very little to enforce the kinds of separations that we depended on for an ethical government. So the current state of ethics in government, not so good.
Thanks, Noah, for that candid assessment. I'm going to turn next to Randall. Maybe Randall, you could provide us with an overview of what's kind of happened when it comes to, when I say anti-corruption laws, really kind of white collar crime laws.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me here, Jessica. Great to be here. Great to see all of you. So if we're talking about domestic criminal corruption prosecutions, there have been a few high-profile cases during the Trump administration. There were notably 2 members of Congress indicted at about the same time, right before the midterms 2 years ago. Duncan Hunter for embezzling campaign funds and Chris Collins for insider trading. But pretty rare to have a member of Congress indicted, much less 2 in the same month. So that was pretty significant. And there were ongoing cases, some of which started in the Obama administration, such as Sheldon Silver, the Speaker of the New York State Legislature, very powerful state legislator. They had to try him twice, but that conviction was finally upheld after the second trial, and he's in prison. Just recently, there was a major case out in Ohio called the $60 Million Man. Larry Householder was indicted. He was the Speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives, indicted in a RICO bribery scheme for taking bribes related to a nuclear power plant bill. So there have been some significant cases, and of course, the Trump administration in general has been dominated by cases and allegations involving his own administration, most notably the Mueller report, of course, and all the cases that arose out of that, and an impeachment, which was basically although that's a political proceeding, it was a bribery extortion allegation that the president tried to extort the president of Ukraine. So there's been quite a bit going on, but if we take a step back and look at the longer term trends, we have to say that there's actually a trend that's been going on even before the Trump administration for the last 10 years or so. When it comes to domestic white collar criminal prosecutions, in the last 10 years, so since 2011, which was even the first Obama administration, white collar prosecutions in general have declined about 50%. This year alone, they're down by 8%, down 25% from 5 years ago. And the decline's even sharper in public corruptions, or a subset of white collar crime, where those prosecutions are down by 50% in just the past 5 years. I don't think anybody knows exactly, why this is the case. If you're talking about white collar in general, I mean, one thing is that law enforcement, of course, is a finite resource. That any administration sets priorities and goals and what kinds of cases it wants to focus on. And if you're focusing on one area, that means you might have fewer resources to focus on another. So if an administration sets immigration or illegal drugs or whatever else as a priority, there might be fewer resources to devote to white collar crime, both within the FBI and within prosecutors' offices. Part of it, and again, that's been a trend that's going on for a long time. But I personally think that when it comes to domestic political corruption, a big part of it is just how difficult the cases have become to prove, due to a trend of Supreme Court cases that actually goes back 20 years. And that this series of cases have made proving domestic corruption so difficult that I think that's got to explain in part kind of the decline in prosecutions, just because it's becoming harder and harder to bring a provable case. And if we trace them just quickly, there's 3 main cases I'd point to out of the Supreme Court in the last 20 years. The first was the Sun Diamond case back in 1999. Prior to Sun Diamond, there was a theory of corruption called a status gratuity, where a gratuity, basically an illegal gift to a public official, you could establish a pattern where someone would sort of have a public official on retainer. So they're giving them a series of gifts or things of value over a period of time. And over that same period of time, the official takes a series of actions, to favor their benefactor. Maybe you can't prove, direct influence to make a bribery case, but you could show this kind of pattern of conduct over time. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours in exchange for all these gifts. And that was considered to be corrupt, which I think most people would agree sounds like a corrupt relationship. In Sun Diamond, the court said, you can't charge that pattern as a gratuity crime. You've got to be able to link a particular gift to a particular official act that you can identify and prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And so ironically, it almost became the case that you could have a long-term, you could have a pattern of conduct going on for years of gifts and official actions that became more difficult to prove than maybe a single isolated incident where I gave you a gift because you voted a certain way, something like that. Maybe you could prove that after Sun Diamond, but if you had this long-term pattern of conduct but you couldn't necessarily prove any one-to-one links, a particular gift for a particular action, now after Sun Diamond, you can't charge that as a gratuity. So that drastically limited the scope of 18 U.S.C. 201, which is the bribery and gratuity law. That was the first step. Then we got the Skilling case in 2010. So after the Sun Diamond case, there was still another avenue prosecutors could use to pursue kind of ongoing corrupt relationships. It was called honest services fraud. And that was kind of a catch-all corruption theory that had been adopted way back in the 1940s and 50s and became increasingly popular in the 2000s, I think in part in wake of Sun Diamond. Prosecutors could charge this kind of ongoing pattern of corruption as honest services fraud. Then in the Skilling case in 2010, which involved the CEO of Enron, the Supreme Court scaled back honest services fraud and said, well, the statute's too vague. It's kind of this idea of the intangible right to honest services that you could charge a politician with defrauding their constituents of honest services. That's really kind of fuzzy and amorphous, and it can't really form the basis for a criminal prosecution. So we're going to save the statute by a limiting interpretation and say it only applies to bribery and kickbacks cases. So that narrowed the statute, but it also cut out a lot of types of honest services fraud that had been charged in the past, including things like conflicts of interest and self-dealing. Those are no longer covered as honest services fraud, and ended up making honest services fraud really almost kind of redundant of other statutes that are already on the books, because bribery and kickbacks are already illegal. So you can charge them as honest services, or you can charge them under another statute, but you haven't really expanded the scope of corruption in the law at all. You've in fact narrowed it. So that took honest services fraud out of the picture. And then most recently, and the one most people have heard about, or maybe more familiar with recently, is the Bob McDonnell decision, where the governor of Virginia was charged with honest services fraud on bribery theory, as well as some other crimes for a series of gifts, accepting $170,000 in secret gifts from a benefactor, Johnny Williams, who was trying to get some business with the Virginia state government. And in exchange for these things like paying for the caterer at their daughter's wedding and giving Donald a Rolex and $120,000 in no interest, no paperwork, quote unquote loans, which were probably going to be gifts until they were discovered. He sought McDonnell's help in trying to get business from the Virginia government. And I think, pardon me. So the prosecutors charged that as a bribery case. Basically, in exchange for all these gifts, McDonnell was trying to help Williams get the government of Virginia to sort of research this dietary supplement that his company made and help promote it. Williams never really got what he wanted because McDonnell, all he did was make some phone calls, try to set up some meetings, things like that. Nothing ever really came of it. That goes to the Supreme Court, but the jury convicted him without any problem, and the Fourth Circuit unanimously affirmed that conviction, saying basically Williams had bought influence from Governor McDonnell. McDonnell tried to do some things on his behalf, didn't work out, but he still tried. He still sold the power of his office. That sounds corrupt. And that went to the Supreme Court in 2016. 9-0, the Supreme Court reversed those convictions and said, by adopting a really narrow definition of what is an official act for purposes of federal bribery law, saying that, which is the act that the official has to do in exchange for the bribe, and adopting this very strained, I believe, and narrow definition of that term to say arranging meetings, making phone calls, arranging introductions, things like that, those are not official acts under the bribery law, and so they can't support a bribery conviction. And so now every public corruption case, pretty much in the wake of that, in the wake of McDonnell, has a official act issue now. Now, one of the first things everybody says is, well, what I did wasn't an official act. And so even when we have a clear pattern of trying to buy influence from a public official, if the types of things that were done in exchange don't rise now to this McDonald's standard, that too can't be charged as corruption. And to give kind of a blatant example, I could charge, if I'm the governor, I could charge people $10,000 to set up meetings with members of my staff. Yeah. You don't pay me, no meeting. All right, so I'm selling access to my administration so you can get in the room and try to make your pitch. As long as I don't tell them how to decide, as long as I don't tell my staff what to do, I could take those $10,000 payments to arrange the meetings. And under McDonald now, that's not bribery, that's not corrupt. So when this pattern of decisions over 20 years has really taken away a lot of the tools that federal prosecutors had to pursue criminal corruption cases. But that's fixable, which we'll talk about in the next segment, because these are statutes that could be amended, could be reformed, and could give the prosecutors some of those tools back. So that's what we'll talk about when we talk about the future.
Thanks, Randall. And while you were speaking, I was reminded of my favorite aspect of the prosecution, which was the many pictures of Bob McDonnell and his Rolex.
Yeah.
Like this, I found a link to the Richmond newspaper where they showed the many pictures. There's actually a slideshow in there. You could see the Rolex. I always joke. What's that?
He's holding up the Rolex while he's driving Johnny Williams' Ferrari.
Yeah, the Ferrari picture too. Yes, the Ferrari.
Yeah.
And I have to say, and I don't know if you covered in your course, but at least in my anti-corruption course, I always joke that Rolex always seems to be the bribery watch of choice. And Alexandra, I'm sure, could probably agree with me somewhat in her FCPA assessments. It's always about the Rolex. So, and speaking of the FCPA, thank you for that overview. That's fascinating. We've had some questions come in, and I will encourage everyone to continue to put questions in the chat function, because we are going to try to get to as many questions as we can after these first two rounds of questions at the end. So we will hold that question and get to it and come back. But speaking of the FCPA, I'm going to now turn to Alexandra Wragge, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what's happened globally with anti-corruption in the past 4 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's challenging to talk about the FCPA and global anti-corruption enforcement in this context because the trends are so sluggish. They're so slow. We don't see a case brought and resolved over the course of a year. We have, of course, 40 years of bipartisan support for the FCPA. It was pretty slow at the outset, but there's been a great deal of US leadership on this issue. And there is no question that we are losing ground. We're losing ground numerically, and we're losing ground, to Noah's point, I'll use the word normatively, right? We have cynics who are tossing back at Americans, at the business community, this whole America First theme. They're flagging the president's denigration of international organizations, the same international organizations that were absolutely critical to building the coalition against corruption. A lot of this is anecdotal, of course, but on international phone calls with foreign companies, you get this very strong sense that, you can take this up with them again once we have our house in order. They refer to the leases that benefit the Trump organization, many of the things that Noah referred to, the opacity, the declining to provide tax returns, even more recently, that strange rally stunt with ExxonMobil, talking about how the president could demand political contribution in exchange for getting permits. ExxonMobil, of course, wanted the world to know that that wasn't an accurate story. It was just an example on the part of the president. But it's really difficult to regain any sort of leadership role in this once it's lost. Once you've lost the narrative thread, we all know this, everybody in the compliance world knows this, that reputation is sticky. And one of the things that's been fascinating and a little sad for me is how quickly that happened. It really was, I was at an event in China just weeks after the inauguration, and comments were being made about the US stepping back from its leadership role on this. Why does this matter for trends? Well, it matters for a lot of reasons, but one of them is FCPA cases require international cooperation. The very nature of an anti-bribery case, an international anti-bribery case, is that it crosses borders. And one of the reasons the US has been so good at prosecuting these cases, bringing these enforcement actions is that they get the cooperation from prosecutors overseas. So instead of having to go through this very onerous MLAT process, instead they can pick up the phone, ask for the documents they need, and get them. So what are we seeing in the actual enforcement numbers? Again, this is tricky because the numbers are so slow moving, but the total number of cases, both in the US and internationally, for 2017, 18, and 19, we track this on our global enforcement report, were down from 2016. Now, 2016 was a pretty high watermark, so how much do we read into that? And I can hear people already saying, but what about 2020? 2020 is going to be an extraordinary year, perhaps not for the number of enforcement actions, but for the dollars. But then, you know, my response to that is Airbus, Cardinal Health, Alexion, Herbalife, and just yesterday, Goldman Sachs were all initiated under the previous administration. Those cases were all initiated under an Obama administration. I mean, huge credit to the Department of Justice to bringing them through to a resolution. But it's very difficult to know if they would have been initiated and resolved in the same way if they had started under this administration. So we just don't know. And the real question is, what's in the pipeline now? If these cases take 3, 5, sometimes 8 years to resolve, what's coming through the pipeline? And we don't have a lot of visibility into that. But again, anecdotally, the pipeline is thinning out dramatically. And the corporate counterpart to that, when I talk to companies, is they will talk very freely about how their compliance budgets have either been frozen or actually have been reduced. You could certainly say that some of that was in response to the pandemic, but this was a trend that started prior to the pandemic. And then the other thing is, and I always see this as the real canary in the coal mine, the companies that I talk to and the companies that we survey are less inclined now than they have been for a very long time to voluntarily disclose. And that's a place where I think we've really, really lost ground. Over time, an enormous number of enforcement actions have come to light because of voluntary disclosure. And companies, to a greater extent now than in the past 2 decades, are hunkering down and making the decision, again, a gross generalization, because of course I speak to just a small sample of companies. They're hunkering down and saying, if we don't bring this to the enforcement agency's attention, either they are unlikely to find it or we wouldn't get much of a benefit in any event, and they're not bringing those forward. And that, I think, bears out the theory that the pipeline is thinning. Some cases make it into the pipeline because of the enforcement agencies being very proactive, but a lot of those come from companies. And companies, I think, or companies are saying that if they don't have the resources to fight this, then they'll take their chances, remedy the problem, good, well-governed companies, remedy the problem, and then go forward without disclosing to the government. What you see then is if cases start to diminish, and we don't know if that's going to happen, but that seems to be the direction the trend is pointing, then fewer cases make it into the headlines and companies begin to perceive that there is less risk for this conduct, and that, as Randall said, that the government may be prioritizing immigration issues or drug issues and deprioritizing white-collar crime. So that's what we're seeing. I don't have anything more conclusive than that because, again, we'll have to talk in about 2 years to know for sure.
Thanks, Alexandra. I think for those of us that, similar to you, you speak with a lot of international audiences, for those that of us that do a lot of work with developing countries to help them to improve their laws, I think it's been particularly challenging. I have a story that I often share, and I'm actually going to provide a link to the retelling of the story of right after Trump was elected president, and I was doing training for a Latin American country, government officials from a Latin American country who have very distinct corruption issues in the country. And I had to explain, I was talking about our ethics laws and how strong they are, except they don't apply to our own president. And you could hear laughter in the room from the officials. So truly, that's not something that had ever happened to me in the many years before that I had been doing kind of similar presentations. So that says a lot. And I'll put a link to an article where I talk about that a little bit as well. Okay, So thank you for those initial things. And again, if anybody has additional questions, please stick them in the chat. We will get to them. Let's go for looking forward now. The election's coming up in 11 days. We don't know who's going to win, but what could happen? Either a prediction about what could happen, or what things based on what you've just told us would you like to see happen going forward? So with that, I'll circle back to Noah, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about what kind of things you'd like to see happen with respect to ethics laws going forward.
Absolutely. And, obviously I'm going to be very, very careful as the head of a nonpartisan nonprofit, not to, not to get into electoral comparisons. But I do think that, as I set out before, the last number of years have really put a spotlight on the gaps in our ethics laws, and both in terms of conduct and people that are not covered, and also in terms of enforcement mechanisms. And I think that I think certainly my hope is that we will find ourselves either after this election or sometime before too long in a place where there is a political appetite and demand for real reform to strengthen those laws and kind of restore an ethical government, which I think is look, ethics are good. We all are in positions that are based on promoting ethics and opposing corruption. But I think it's become really clear that ultimately you can't really have a functioning democracy if you don't have a system where the government is working for the benefit of the country and the people, as opposed to for the benefit of those in charge. So this is fundamental stuff. And I think there actually is a possibility for significant reform before too long. The House of Representatives at the beginning of 2019 passed a bill. It was HR 1, which means it was the first bill that the House introduced in that session, called the For the People Act, which did a number of things. It had major campaign finance reforms, it had major voting rights reforms, and some pretty significant ethics reforms, including essentially requiring presidents and vice presidents and candidates to disclose tax returns, including at least some measures to push the president and vice president to divest from business ownership, strengthening of the Office of Government Ethics in order to have more enforcement of ethics rules. And then much more recently, members of the House and Senate have introduced another piece of legislation called the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which has some measures for more transparency and more enforcement connected to emoluments clause violations. It has measures protecting inspectors general and protecting the Department of Justice from interference from the White House and from political actors. It has some key measures strengthening the Hatch Act, including strengthening enforcement of that. Because again, when you have people using the levers of government for elections, it essentially can be, the government using its own powers to keep itself in power, which starts to look authoritarian rather than democratic. And I think it is certainly possible that if the results of this election seem to be a referendum for the need for reform, that you could see legislation like those pieces of legislation having some real prospect of moving through, of being passed, but potentially being signed into law. And I think that actually those pieces of legislation are really, just the tip of the iceberg, and there needs to be, really a comprehensive look at how do you make particularly the executive branch work in an ethical and democratic way, which can involve, really comprehensive requirements that there be divestiture from businesses that could cause conflicts. It can be strengthening nepotism laws. It can be strengthening divisions between sources of executive power and specific investigations and prosecutions. So, I certainly would like to see more of that. I think there is the potential that, if there is an election result that is either now or sometime later that is seen as a real call from the public for reform, there's an opportunity, maybe of passing some of these kinds of laws. I'm interested to hear from Randall on the sort of anti-corruption side. I think in some ways, I mean, the things I was just talking about, none of that's going to be easy. It's going to be really hard to pass any of those laws. I think strengthening criminal corruption laws in some ways is a different animal because so many, there was a question along these lines, but so many folks in the judicial branch and the legislative branch look at corruption laws from the perspective of, could this be turned against me if I did something that seemed pretty innocuous? And it's really hard to get people anywhere on the political spectrum to pass those. I worked on legislation on that for a long time in the Senate and have followed it. At times legislation in those areas also have gotten bipartisan support. But there's a resistance in the areas of ethics and corruption to doing anything, government officials doing anything that could come back to haunt them themselves. And so there has to be a real public push to get movement in that area. I'm hopeful that there will be one.
No, if I could just ask one quick follow-up, because it relates to, I think we have a few students dealing with this with their notes, but the failure, not necessarily the enforcement and applicability and norms and all the things that we've been talking about and passing legislation, but one issue too is the failure to fill positions, whether it's an open position for an IG or the MSPB or the Federal Election Commission. I mean, what can we do about, because that's not even new under the past 4 years. Is there something that can be done to help in that area? Because we know that, for example, the MSPB not being a Merit Systems Protection Board, not being, formed really at this point, impacts not only whistleblowers but also Hatch Act enforcement. So what do you think? Is there something that could be done in that area too?
Yeah, I mean, there are laws in place that restrict the ability to put in place acting officials. If there isn't a nominated and confirmed official in certain kind of positions, there are restrictions on how long the president can kind of put somebody in place without going through the Senate. But it's turned out that even those laws are difficult to enforce and are pretty limited. So strengthening some of the laws that in order to really restrict the president's ability to put people in place on an acting basis, and make sure that those kinds of positions go to career officials in places like inspector general's offices. If nobody is confirmed through the Senate, that could be powerful. In other words, if the president knows that he's going to kind of be stuck with the most senior career official, if he doesn't actually nominate someone and get someone confirmed, that's some incentive. That still wouldn't get you to places like the Merit Systems Protection Board or the Federal Election Commission, which nobody's put in place on an acting basis if nobody is confirmed. And so, I think you'd have to amend the laws kind of constituting those bodies to come up with some type of other solution or some type of incentive to the president and Congress to fill those positions. I absolutely agree that is a huge problem. This president has been able to go around Congress by not nominating people, not confirming people, just kind of pushing his own people into place. And those people are less susceptible to oversight, less beholden to ethics rules. less likely to do any kind of enforcement, and that's a problem.
Jessica, I think if I could jump in a related issue to that I've been sort of fascinated by when Noah talks about how much of this in the past has kind of depended on norms and, you know, expecting people of good faith to act with goodwill and fulfilling their obligations. And what do you do when that doesn't happen? This idea of the Senate refusing to confirm people. You know, I mean, how do you enforce that if you end up with a president of one party and a Senate controlled by the opposite party? I think the last couple of years have suggested you could see a scenario where, for example, they just refuse to confirm any of the president's appointments. The Senate just won't take them up. And, you know, what can you do about that, if anything? Because, again, there's nothing in the Constitution that says they're actually required to have the hearing by a certain date or anything like that. And there's no legal enforcement mechanism. And so, again, trying to think about ways to maybe put some actual enforcement teeth behind some of these things that have historically just been norms and that actually worked out fairly well for the most part until recent history is going to be an interesting challenge.
Yeah, if you recall, last year we had a panel at GW on high profile white collar defense, and we had a bunch of high profile white collar defense attorneys come, and I know Randall, you were there, and there was a bit of laughter from the defense attorneys about kind of the enforcement of like congressional subpoenas and just the ability to get witnesses to show. And they basically said, well, this administration's just revealed them for kind of like the paper tiger that it is. And so it shows you that there is kind of there has been this norm following that when you actually boils down to compliance, how difficult it can actually be when you need to compel something.
Right.
So I'm going to keep you on the hot spot, Randall. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you'd like to see or what you predict could happen after the election and/or discuss potential reforms.
Sure. So when we talk about white collar, I think an interesting or important thing to remember is just how hard these cases are to prove in the first place. If we have a street crime, a violent crime, a homicide, a burglary, things like that, it's clear a crime has taken place. Even in other types of white collar besides corruption, like a fraud, at some point, it becomes clear that the crime has been committed, the victims emerge, and then they're willing to help the government prosecute the case and provide information and, you know, documents and whatever else they can to try to help, you know, go after the defendant. In corruption cases, if I'm paying a bribe to a member of Congress, unless we're pretty clumsy, there's nobody else in the room, we don't want anybody else to know about it, that crime doesn't create any, you know, physical evidence that suggests that it's happened. So it's very hard to detect in the first place. And the victims, or the voters, the public, they have no idea the crime has happened, unlike the victim of a violent crime.
Unless it's Duke Cunningham and you have a price list.
Unless it's Duke Cunningham, which is, yeah, great case. But that's basically the point. Only the most blatant, clumsy, you know, offenders at this point get detected and potentially prosecuted. If you're sophisticated at all, it's pretty easy to keep these crimes from coming to light. So given how hard they are to prove and how hard they are to detect in the first place, and then to actually prosecute them takes a tremendous amount of resources. You know, if you look at something like the Sheldon Silver case going on for years and years, or the Bob Menendez case a couple of years ago that was a, you know, massive, you know, litigation for a couple of years and ended in a hung jury, and, you know, he was not convicted. So if we don't give prosecutors the tools that they used to have, you know, if we don't have some kind of reforms to make these, put some enforcement teeth back in these statutes, I think we're going to continue to see sort of fewer and fewer cases of that trend that we've seen. So I do have kind of a wish list, you know, if I were writing this stuff, but, you know, Noah makes an excellent point that it seems to be very hard to get these kinds of reforms passed through Congress. You know, there's the old line about you got the foxes guarding the hen house, right? Are they going to really beef up the corruption, the legislation that could be used to come after them? But if there's enough of a wave from the public and enough of a demand from the public, you could see that happening. So there are some pretty easy fixes, you know, that these are just statutory fixes. It's not that these crimes are sort of constitutionally mandated to be as narrow as the Supreme Court has made them. And in fact, the court itself frequently says, hey, this is what we think the statute means. If we've got it wrong, Congress can fix it, right? And Congress doesn't fix it. But if they did, it would be pretty straightforward. You could amend 201 to change the definition of an official act. So you could overturn McDonnell through legislation and make it clear that a bribe can apply to any sort of exercise of official discretion, any exercise of official power, and get rid of this very convoluted, narrow official act definition, which would actually parallel some state statutes that refer to things like paying a public official for an exercise of official discretion, including the Virginia state statute, interestingly enough. So you could expand the definition of official act and overturn McDonnell by legislation. You could fix Sun Diamond also by legislation pretty easily by making it clear that corruption can be established through this, the stream of benefits theory is sometimes called, or this string of gifts over time and a series of official acts over time without requiring this strict one-to-one link up that now Sun Diamond requires, and bring those kinds of politician on retainer long-term corruption cases back within the ambit of 201. You could reform honest services fraud to make it clear that it's not just another bribery statute, but that it covers other types of official misconduct as well, including conflicts of interest and self-dealing, things like that. I mean, right now, if I take a $100,000 bribe to give a contract to a particular company, that's honest services fraud. If instead I steer that same contract to a company that I own without telling anybody that I own the company and make $100,000, that's not honest services fraud, even though the harm is exactly the same, right? I mean, the contract's going not to the qualified company, but to benefit me. I'm making $100,000. Harm is exactly identical. One is honest services fraud, one isn't. Just as that's a consequence of the skilling decision, but it doesn't make much sense. And you could fix things like that legislatively. And not in terms of adding more crimes, but in terms of helping deterrence. I mean, things like the Disclosure Act that's been introduced for years now, but never passed, but disclosing there was some question in the chat about dark money. Requiring all these dark money groups that are, participating in campaigns to disclose their donors, the way that a PAC has to. So get more sunlight into who's backing all these groups that are then promoting these different candidates, because that's a deterrent to corruption, right? Any kind of public disclosure of these types of political activities is a deterrent to potential corruption and helps inform the public. So I think I'd love to see something like that passed. And then that Protect Our Democracy Act that Noah mentioned has a lot of great things in it. In addition to the ethics reforms and Hatch Act reforms and things like that, there's also, clarifying that granting a pardon can be a bribe. And you could be, making that clear. I think that's already true under the bribery law, but would make it clear that, dangling pardons to witnesses against you or granting a pardon could potentially be a bribe. It tries to speed up the congressional investigation process, requires those investigations to be fast-tracked within the courts and beefs up contempt of Congress power, things like that. So again, not that they're more crimes, but they improve the ability of Congress to sort of investigate and potentially expose that kind of corruption. So I think you could put together, a great legislative package of reforms for the criminal corruption laws. And then the most important thing, to get back to what I started with about the long-term trend, is you need a Department of Justice and a president to make these cases a priority. That is something that comes from the top. And again, you're allocating potentially scarce resources. And so if you really want a meaningful crackdown on corruption and to try to bring back, these types of prosecutions and increase them again, you need an administration that thinks that's a priority and that sends that word out, to everybody within the Department of Justice.
Thanks, Randall. Alexandra, maybe you could touch on what you predict going forward, although you did preview that we needed to wait 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely. We know what we get with President Trump. He has, by his actions, been anti-transparency and he is avowedly anti-business regulation. So that's pretty clear. But I don't really have this sort of wish list that Noah and Randall have domestically, because so much of that was based on norms. The FCPA, again, has been doing pretty well for us. And we know what we get with President Trump. So I went back through and I looked for quotes from candidate Biden, and well, before he was a candidate, to see if I could get any perspective from that. So I'm going to read from these to make sure that I get them right. All the way back in 1976, during hearings, Biden said, "I get really very upset and concerned about not just the bribery, but how it flies directly in the face of our own foreign policy and the best interests of our government." Trump, back in 2012, as everybody knows, called the FCPA a horrible law. More recently, Biden, in a foreign affairs article just this year, wrote, "An insidious pandemic, corruption is fueling oppression, corroding human dignity, and equipping authoritarian leaders with a powerful tool to divide and weaken democracies across the world." Trump is credibly reported to have told Secretary of State Tillerson that he wanted to, quote, scrap the FCPA. And then on a slightly more personal note, and not exactly personal to the candidates, and not exactly bribery, but certainly related, Biden, notably a former Delaware senator, has said that he will go after illicit tax havens. The Trump Organization, by comparison, has over 250 companies registered in Delaware, where LLCs aren't required to provide financial information. So I think those themes are broad. The most interesting thread that I have read through the Biden campaign material is with respect to the link between anti-corruption and national security. That theme comes through over and over again. There's a campaign document related to Central America, where it isn't just anti-corruption for anti-corruption's sake, it's tying it to national security. And I think if he can do that, we'll really see things move forward substantially. In that same document, he talked about providing more training to foreign prosecutors with respect to anti-corruption cases. He's spoken out about shell companies. As I said, he's talking about re-engaging with the international community, having a democracy summit early on. So I think we can have confidence that, some confidence, that under a second term with President Trump, it would be more of the same and a shift away from transparency toward other priorities that resonate with his narrative. And that under President Biden, we would see a renewed embrace of transparency and of the international partnerships that we need to ensure that we can advance this. And again, under the umbrella of national security, which I think is completely appropriate and too little discussed.
Great, thank you for that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to our questions. My colleague has taken a walk out. He had to go to I know we have a faculty meeting going on right now, but my colleague Christy Skins asked, a colleague in the white collar bar traced the series of Supreme Court decisions that Professor Eliason is discussing to a somewhat surprising basis, that the justices are reluctant to hold others to a criminal standard. The justices, who apparently receive various benefits as justices, may have difficulty meeting. Is there a better explanation for the pattern here for the Supreme Court decisions that make anti-corruption prosecution so difficult? Our students from abroad have been astounded, for example, that it is not criminal under US law for a governor to sell meetings in return for gifts. So this is for you, for Professor Eliason.
Unmute, there we go. So that's pretty interesting. It's sort of a common thing you hear about white collar crime in general, not just corruption, that historically it's been often punished less severely than other types of criminal activity, and treated more leniently, not prosecuted as often. And one argument is that the judges themselves can identify so much more readily with the white collar criminals that they see in their courtroom. Looks like their friend from the country club, as opposed to a street crime defendant or someone like that they don't really identify with. And so, I think it's hard to know, I think, how much of a role that plays, but that is a common theme or observation about white collar law enforcement in general. When it comes to the Supreme Court, I don't think the kind of benefits that, the justices get, being asked to go abroad and teach and things like that, would give them concern about really being prosecuted themselves, because those aren't done corruptly, right? They're done openly and disclosed or at least they should be. And, you know, a common response when people like McDonnell or the people defending McDonnell talked about, well, you're going to be criminalizing these routine political interactions. If I go give a speech at the Rotary Club and they give me breakfast, now I could be prosecuted. You know, the response to that is no, because prosecutors have to prove corrupt intent beyond a reasonable doubt. And those routine political interactions, those things that are publicly disclosed, that are within legal limits, things like that, you could never prove corrupt intent. And so those kinds of cases are not going to be brought. So at least particularly when it comes to McDonnell, but I think also with Skilling, the explanation for the decisions is just a real concern about the breadth of federal criminal law in general. And this is another white collar theme that it potentially sweeps in so much conduct that the justices feel the need to step in and try to rein it in some cases. I don't think necessarily because they see it applying to them, but just out of due process concerns about, you know, the general public being on notice about what's prohibited and what isn't. Because a lot of times in white collar, we're talking about, you know, conduct that otherwise might be perfectly legal. You know, it's not inherently criminal, like breaking into someone's house and stealing their electronics or knocking someone over the head and robbing them. I mean, if I'm, you know, destroying my files, for example, or, you know, giving money to a politician, you know, that could be perfectly legal depending on my state of mind, or it could be a crime. And so because you're potentially criminalizing conduct that's not sort of inherently evil, I think there's a real concern about making sure that the statutes are read more narrowly, but I think they've swung way too far.
If I could comment a little bit on that too. I agree with a lot of parts of what Randall said, but just wanted to add a few things. You know, I think it is telling that those Supreme Court decisions that have weakened anti-corruption law are all 9-0 decisions, and that in the McDonnell case, you had amicus briefs from these, you know, bipartisan groups of former governors, former attorneys general, former, you know, senators and whatnot. And the amicus briefs on the other side were from like me and a couple of other people. It was, you know, I think that it goes to a couple of things. On one is, I do think there is some legitimate concern for laws that are very broad. You could certainly argue that honest services fraud, pre-skilling, while I think the case law did a reasonably good job of delineating it, you know, the statute itself didn't give you a whole lot of comfort as to exactly what it applied to and what it didn't necessarily. But on the other hand, I really have seen, and I think a lot of it comes to, I think Randall's right, that it's not that Supreme Court justices think that they would be guilty of bribery if the McDonnell case had gone the other way. But I think there is an identification with the defendants in these cases. You know, I remember going to the oral argument in Skilling and this sort of crazy line of questioning from Justice Breyer, of all people, about like, well, then, you know, you could have a federal employee sitting at his desk doing the racing forms, and that could be considered honest services fraud because he's not acting in the best interest of the people. And putting aside that it sounds like he was in the 1940s for some reason, it was a really kind of weird, you know, slippery slope kind of fear that, you know, other sort of good, well-meaning government officials who maybe do something inadvertent could get caught up. And, you know, I mean, I remember working for a senator on a piece of legislation to strengthen some of these laws. And I remember another senator coming up and saying, you know, why are you trying to go after the 435 members of Congress with so hard with this legislation? And you know, the legislation applied to every government employee who works for the federal government, and in some cases state governments. It wasn't targeted at the 435 or 535 members of Congress, but that's the lens through which they saw it. And I do think that it's not all self-protection, but there is a certain level of self-identification that makes members of Congress and judges and maybe certain presidents, more reluctant to go down the path of having tough anti-corruption laws.
That's
Can
an
I-
interesting. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Respond to a question in the chat, I think, based on what I said earlier, so maybe I wasn't clear. Corrupting public officials is not inherently evil. Well, yes, it is. But paying a public official is not inherently evil, which is the example I was using. And I can hand a politician a stack of money. If that's a legal campaign contribution and it's properly reported, nothing wrong with it. If it's a bribe, there is something wrong with it. And that all depends on our state of mind, on the reason I'm giving him. So it's not that giving money to a public official is not inherently evil. There might be a perfectly legal, valid reason for doing it.
I just wanted to, thanks, Randall. I think that just to add what Noah was saying, I think a lot of us were really surprised by the outcome in the McDonald case. I remember in the lead up to the Supreme Court decision, we used to do a case study in my anti-corruption class where students had to effectively play the role of, counsel to, I think I called him Rob McConnell or something. I had a play on his name. And at the time, we based it pretty closely, maybe a few extra facts here or there to have students consider other issues, but we based it really closely on the actual fact pattern. And I remember I had a former prosecutor sitting next to me in class, then defense attorney, who turned to me and said, "Man, we've really got to edit these facts because these are so straightforward for the prosecution and conviction of McConnell that we really got to do something about this to make it more even-handed for the students." And yet this is what happened. So I too I still find that surprising about what happened with the amicus briefs. Okay, I know we've got some additional questions I want to get to. Eric asks, and I'm going to go with the first one because he asks a few. The IRS has stated that it doesn't have the resources to prosecute tax offenses for wealthy tax avoiders. So is it realistic to believe that the political will exists to reform white collar crime statutes?
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump out in front. I think, and I want to, this sort of goes to a little bit what I was saying before, and I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that all government, all members of Congress or all judges are corrupt and just want to want to strike down any corruption enforcement, because that's not where I'm coming from at all. And I've certainly seen a lot of folks who have pushed hard for anti-corruption enforcement. I just think that they often need a push, and so I think the political will is there when people demand it. I think there are some members of Congress who are, laser focused on these issues and want to strengthen ethics laws and strengthen corruption laws. I think there are ways of appealing to judges that will, get better results. But I think a lot of it comes down to, the people making clear that this is something they care about. So in 2006, there was an election that was widely seen as being a referendum on corruption in the wake of people like Jack Abramoff and Tom DeLay and a set of scandals. And Congress came in 2007 and quickly passed, the biggest sort of ethics reform that it had passed in quite some time. Turns out that they were handling one set of things. They didn't handle a whole lot of other things that have come back to bite us. But the House came in 2019 following an election that also people saw as reflecting corruption, and they quickly passed legislation that would reform campaign finance and ethics and voting rights. It didn't move through the Senate and the president, but it could if there is if there's a perception that political momentum that the people are calling for that. So I do. I do think there can be the political will there. Often what happens is, there's this great popular anger. And so people come into power based on that anger, feel the need to do something to address that. And so they pass a thing on ethics and corruption, and then they're done with it and they don't worry about it again until the next set of scandals. And that is part of why, my organization we are spending a lot of time figuring out what that thing needs to be so that we're ready for it when that window opens. We're also going to be pushing to try to keep that window open, so it's not just one piece of legislation. But I think there can be political will, but it's tough.
Thanks, Noah. So Camille asked if there's been, have there been anti-corruption or ethical concerns with the politicization of the DOJ or the AG specifically? Any solutions? I also want to point that to Alexandra too, because I have been asked that question with respect to the FCPA unit, and whether there's a concern whether at some point that will trickle down to them as well, or maybe you think so too. I want to start with Alexandra to maybe answer that, and then I want to go to the bigger issue with maybe Noah or Randall about the DOJ.
Yeah, again, it's about messaging, right? It's about the perception internationally of how seriously the U.S. is taking this issue, and we were already in a bit of a hole on this issue because most of the world believes that the fact that at any given time the largest 9 of the largest 10 penalties under the FCPA were levied against non-U.S. companies headquartered outside the U.S. And when I traveled, back when we did that, everywhere I went, some minority of people would argue that the FCPA was being used to bludgeon other countries and to get a competitive advantage for US companies. So given that we were already struggling against that story, I mean, I would argue that the Department of Justice goes where the crime takes it. But given that we were already struggling against that narrative, having a more bold-faced, biased, politicized Department of Justice can only be a bad thing for our reputation internationally, because if the Department of Justice appears to be favoring the interests of the incumbent president, and if as in this case, the president has commercial interests, then that all gets knotted up very quickly into a situation where the U.S. government, the power of the U.S. government legal system is perceived as targeting, for whatever reason, targeting competitors of American companies, targeting competitors of the president himself, whatever it is. And that is a huge loss to the standing of the United States with respect to its previous leadership role on transparency and anti-bribery. I don't know if all of those lines or all of those dots can be connected in a way that's coherent, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. It's perception. Just to go back just for a moment to the IRS question, you know, the world is awash with corruption. It's everywhere. It's in every country, and there's enormous amounts of it. If word gets out that it's not a priority anymore, then there is, you know, companies don't believe that there is a credible threat of prosecution, and they stop taking remedial action, implementing programs to make sure they're not paying it because they don't believe there's a cost to it. When the IRS actually says they don't have the resources to go after, to audit wealthy Americans, the messaging around that is so incredibly counterproductive and toxic. And I see a real parallel there, because unlike the great work that CREW is doing and the various laws and regulations we need to put into place to document what were previously norms, internationally, it is all a matter of political will, cooperation, where you look for the cases, how vigorously you pursue them, how you partner with other countries in that messaging is critical. This is barely even a legal issue, right? It's far more political than it is legal, and messaging is everything.
Thanks, Alexandra. I want to just circle back on that question domestically. Although that there were some domestic implications of what Alexandra said, but maybe some other thoughts that either Randall or Noah have. It sounds like Randall's already unmuted, so I think he has some thoughts on the politicization of the Justice Department.
Yeah, domestically, it's a huge problem. It's one of my biggest concerns right now is the damage that's been done to the Justice Department through the politicization that we've seen. And as I think Alexandra mentioned earlier, that kind of reputation is very hard to get back once it's damaged. And in every political corruption prosecution, the first thing the defendant says is this is a this is political. This is a witch hunt. They're out to get me. My political opponents are prosecuting me. Even when they're in the same party, Bob Menendez was prosecuted. He's a Democrat prosecuted by the Obama administration, still claimed it was political because they said they didn't like his Cuba policy. So that's automatically the first line of defense. And historically, that never got much traction because there was this long history and norm of the Department of Justice is not political. It's isolated from the White House when it comes to criminal prosecution. There is no political interference with these kinds of cases. And not everybody believed it. Maybe defendants didn't believe it, and the system wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. And there was a good, solid reputation that these prosecutions were not political for the most part. And that's now been so eroded that if the public and jurors, and defendants start to think that law enforcement is just political, it's just another exercise of political power, then that's really dangerous. I mean, that's what they do, in dictatorships. They throw their political opponents in jail, they prosecute them. And we don't do that here. And to the extent that norm of criminal prosecution not being political has been eroded, that becomes really dangerous. And I think one of the biggest tasks is to try to reverse that damage whenever we get that opportunity.
Thanks, Randall. Noah?
So I not to just repeat everything that Randall said, because I agree wholeheartedly, but I remember from my days as a corruption prosecutor and afterwards that it is true that was the defense in every case. And I remember people coming up to me saying, there were instances, I think, during the Bush administration, the Department of Justice prosecuted, say, a Democratic, either maybe a governor in something like Mississippi. I'm fuzzy on the details now, but I remember people coming up to me and saying that was clearly a biased political investigation. And I was able to say, I know the people who prosecuted that case, and I know the department that prosecuted that case. And whatever you might think of one president or another, there was no political motivation. This was totally separate from politics. This was based on the law and the facts. And whatever jury ultimately gets to decide that, but there's no basis for questioning the motivations of the people involved. But that is, the concern is once that credibility goes out the window, then you can't have a political prosecution that is taken seriously, because if there's a chance that it's politically motivated, it's very difficult to separate out at that point the ones that are and the ones that aren't, and they're all looked on with suspicion. We have a situation now where, it's not subtle. You have the president going on TV saying that he wants the attorney general to investigate and prosecute his political opponents, and that is that's not coded. It's overt. You had the president railing against the prosecution of some of his friends, and the attorney general then going in and changing sentencing recommendations, and in one case, senior Justice Department officials dismissing a case even though there had been a guilty plea. At that point, you really do start to lose all confidence that any prosecutions in the political realm are brought based on the merits as opposed to for political reasons. And at that point, it's as Randall and Alexandra said, it's very difficult to get back that credibility and have a system that goes after corruption in a way that people can trust.
Thanks, Noah. Well, on that depressing note, and we are out of time. I really don't. I'm gonna start crying in a corner now. No, but in all seriousness, I think this was a really good discussion today. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all the questions. It's a great topic. I think it remains to be seen. It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done, whatever happens in 11 days. And hopefully we know in 11 days what's going to happen. But with that, I want to thank this fantastic panel for sharing their thoughts about what has come before and what is hopefully to come or may come in the future. You guys were fantastic. I know you're all incredibly busy. So thank you for taking your time to speak to us today. Thank you to everyone who attended, again, to ACCA and to Camille for organizing this great panel. Yeah, I appreciate it. And even though it ended on an unhappy note, thank you and have a wonderful weekend, everyone. And vote. Don't forget to vote. All right. Take care.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
Sorry to be a downer.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.